My name is Robert Mazer. I spent 2 years undercover, laundering tens of millions of dollars for Pablo Escobar's cartel.
My name's Jeff Turner. I printed over $1 million in U.S. banknotes.
My name is Nick Leeson. I'm a former derivatives trader. My reckless trading unfortunately resulted in the collapse of a 233-year-old merchant bank with losses of $1.2 billion.
I'm Jim Browning. I'm known as a scam baiter, and I hack into scammers' CCTV, and I've managed to close down hundreds of scam call centers.
My name is Brett Johnson, former United States most wanted cybercriminal. Through fraud, identity theft, and scams, I was able to steal millions of dollars. And this is how crime works. I built and ran the first organized cybercrime community. It's called ShadowCrew. I regret every single instance of that, of the people that I knew that I victimized, that trusted me, that put faith in me every single day. There's no fixing that. I looked for that opportunity to profit wherever it may be. And I didn't give a damn about my victims, and I didn't care about my victims until I started to interact with victims on this side of the fence.
My online criminal history began doing eBay fraud around the year 1997. And what I mean by eBay fraud is, listing things that I didn't have, getting the money from people and scamming these people.
I was selling cameras that didn't exist. Autographed baseballs, Sammy Sosa, Mark McGwire, and they were selling for $60 on eBay. Go down, buy a case of baseballs, pick up a Sharpie, start autographing them. And typically when I was doing eBay fraud, I'd profit about $12,000 a month. That leads into selling pirated software. So I was doing that, stealing a lot of money, and I got worried about how much was coming in. Thought I was going to be looked at for money laundering, and figured the best thing I could do is get a fake driver's license.
I was going to use the fake ID to open up bank accounts so I could have the stolen money filtered through the bank account, cash out at the ATM. And that's how I happened upon Counterfeit Library.
And Counterfeit Library, they only dealt, it was a degree mill. They dealt in counterfeit degrees and certificates.
It's fake IDs, it's fake work IDs, any type of university degree that you might want.
Send them the $200, send them my picture. 3-4 weeks later, I get this fake driver's license. So I start using it to open up accounts, drop addresses, cash checks, everything else, and stealing even more money. A few weeks into that, and I'm becoming friends with the owners of Counterfeit Library because I was also sharing information about how to commit fraud. Two other individuals come in. One was called Mr. X, was his screen name. The other one was Beelzebub. Beelzebub, he made fake IDs. Mr. X made a very passable Social Security card, and we became buddies. So Beelzebub, he came up with this idea. He's like, Gollum, my screen name was Gollum Fun. I'll sell the fake IDs, Mr. X will sell the Social Security cards, and we'll build this site, this forum. And I was like, sounds like a damn good idea, because I was also sharing information about how to commit fraud. And it became like this criminal field of dreams.
People were welcomed in to share and exchange criminal information. You can simply come in and you can read all of the threads. Something that might be sold as a tutorial would be tax return identity theft, how to file those taxes, where to target those victims. So Counterfeit Library transitioned from a degree mill type of website into a eBay fraud site, a social engineering site, a cybercrime channel site. Initially, my position was as a reviewer. I became basically the gatekeeper of Counterfeit Library. Every single product and service went through me.
So if someone had a product or service for sale, I would get it in, verify it, talk about it, and vouch for that seller. So they would send you physically that driver's license, or that Social Security card, or that passport, or what have you, all right? You'd get it, and you'd give your thoughts on it. And you would say, this seller is reviewed and verified. That tag would then be changed to reviewed seller. The rules that we had, hey, no drugs, no counterfeit currency, no child pornography. Over the space of 1.5 years, 2 years, we were a couple of thousand members at that point. We're doing pretty well with Counterfeit Library. It's fake IDs, it's eBay fraud, PayPal fraud. It's strictly scams, is what it is we're coming across with that. One day, this guy comes over, and he had the screen name Script. He was this Ukrainian spammer, and what he says is he says, hey, I've got credit card information. And Script dealt with what we call the COB, the change of billing, just the credit card details and the ability to update billing information. So you would be able to log into the credit card account. You would see the available balance on that card. These days they refer to it as account takeover. We had never seen anything like that. And the initial response from the community was, this guy has got to be law enforcement. And I was like, hey dude, if you're going to sell on Counterfeit Library, you've got to be reviewed. So he was like, okay, let's get reviewed.
He's like, oh, I need a drop address and a burner phone number. I give him a drop address. I give him a phone number. He gives me the card information, card number, expiration date, 3-digit security code. He's changed that billing information to that drop address and the burner phone number from the actual cardholder information.
I placed an order with Thompson's Computer Warehouse for $4,000. Same card, I also placed an order with Dell's Outlet for $5,000. Goes through $9,000 worth of product. Goes through, get the products shipped to me, they arrive. And the way that works is you would receive the merchandise, and then what would you do? You'd resell it on eBay. I get back online with Script. I post the review on Counterfeit Library. And within the space of 2 to 3 days, Counterfeit Library transitions from that fake ID and eBay fraud to basically a credit card theft site.
Once Script comes in and starts offering credit card details, at that point in time, Counterfeit Library simply explodes.
Turns out that Script had a lot of buddies. They were stealing all these credit cards.
Within 30 to 60 days, we had hundreds of posts per day of people that were looking for this information, of different sellers that were coming out selling credit card details or physical credit cards. We had more traffic than we know what to do with.
There's a few different ways you can steal credit card details. You can get it through phishing schemes. You'd get their name, social, date of birth, card numbers, PINs, all that stuff. And a phishing attack was spray and pray. So you'd send out 2 million emails. If you got 20,000 back, that's a good day. You got 20,000 card numbers all of a sudden. You can do it physically, all right, and that involves a skimmer. Maybe you install one at a bank, at a gas pump, and you insert the card, or you give someone the card, and they've got this little device in their hand, and they swipe the card through, and that captures the credit card details. So there's several different ways to get credit card details and information.
Most of the data was coming out of America. You can't order a lot of computers to a Ukrainian address. You need to order it to an American address and then have them shipped out or cashed out from there.
So Script is the first guy, the first Ukrainian that comes into English-speaking environments, all right? For cybercrime or scams or fraud to succeed online, 3 things have to take place. You have to gather data, gather the tools, you then commit the crime, and then finally you have to be able to cash that crime out. Well, they had the tools. They knew how to commit the crime. What they could not do was cash it out. If you were good, you would profit $30,000 to $40,000 a month. COBs, that change of billing, typically sold for 8 to 10% of whatever the available balance was of that card.
So if you're buying just stolen credit card details, just the cardholder's name, number, address, things like that, that's going to run, $7 up to maybe $30 per card. Where do you put that money? Well, I had a house in Charleston, South Carolina, spare bedroom, cashed a lot of it in there. I also had bank accounts in several different countries.
When I was a criminal, I lived very quietly. I had a house on the water. It was not an expensive house. I would typically eat at home. If I ate at a restaurant, it would be someplace like Applebee's, something like that. So I was able to save some money, but you have to understand that when I was committing crime, money got to the point where you didn't understand the value of it. The way ShadowCrew pops up, this distance learning guy was a big advocate for distance learning, and he found out about Counterfeit Library. Not that we were committing fraud or credit theft. He didn't give a damn about that. He gave a damn about the degrees, the fake degrees they were selling. So his members from his forum, a couple of thousand, they come over and start bombarding the forums there. So we can't conduct any business all of a sudden. One of the ID guys, his name was Seth Sanders.
He goes off and he builds ShadowCrew.com. He had maybe 60 members at that point in time. Not much traffic.
But the site looks damn good and it operates really well. He comes back over and he's like, Gollum, why don't you come over to ShadowCrew? And I was like, man, we can do that. Make me super admin. Let me make whatever subforums I want. Put the number of people that I want in charge of those forums. He's like, absolutely. So we shut down basically the forums at Counterfeit, transition over to ShadowCrew.
It was an explosion of users all of a sudden. So ShadowCrew was really the precursor of today's dark web markets, and financial cybercrime as we know it. It was the first real structured forum and communication channel for online criminal activity.
You knew by looking at someone's screen name what the skill level was, what the history of that individual was. We had escrow systems. So if someone didn't trust another, they could go through me initially, and I would hold the money until they got their item, then I would pay the seller. Now, before these criminal communities, the only avenue you had to network with other criminals was IRC, Internet Relay Chat. It was a rolling chat board. You had no idea who you were talking to, if you could trust them, if they had a product or service, if it worked, if they had it, or if they were just going to rip you off, because everyone there was a crook. So ShadowCrew at its height was 4,000 members strong. So out of 4,000 members, you may have had 60 to 80 different sellers. Most of it's credit-based. Most of the credit-based is online details. We had passport guys, we had fake ID guys, stuff like that as well. We were naive criminals. Many of us were, all right? We were simply these, we thought we were computer guys, and stealing information and profiting from that. What we didn't appreciate is if you're living a criminal lifestyle, how are you going to make sure that no one rips you off? And at the end of the day, it relies on violence. All right, that's really what you have to resort to. We had never seen any violence at all on ShadowCrew, any of those platforms.
One day a user comes in,
and he starts posting these pictures of a guy who had ripped him off. And he had the guy kidnapped and beaten. And it comes with a message: never steal from me. And that's the first instance of violence that we saw on that platform. Who's involved in cybercrime these days? Every criminal group that is imaginable as taking part in cybercrime, because they view it as more safe. It's certainly more profitable. You absolutely see the Italian mob, you see the Mexican cartels coming in. You've got these scam farms that are out there, these buildings, these organized elements coming together are different than it was when I was a criminal. You've got an actual compound or community of people that are working together, running different basic departments in order to make sure that that fraud, that crime is successful. They're really running it more business-like than we did when we were committing crime.
We had tens of thousands of hits that were coming in per day. But you have to remember that you could access ShadowCrew without being registered. Now, we were able to see the IP addresses that were coming in.
It was evident that law enforcement they had several identities on ShadowCrew.
Back then, how do you avoid detection? What's your operational security? You would try to have the server located in a country where it was difficult for law enforcement to subpoena anything from it. I moved a lot from Kentucky to Tennessee to South Carolina. I would try to find hot spots that I could use that weren't in my home. You did not have access to these proxy addresses where you could hide your IP address. It wasn't until later that those things came online.
Rightfully or not, I was scared to death that RICO was going to come down on my head and I was going to get the brunt of everything. So I retire, step out of ShadowCrew. About the same time I stepped out, our forum techie, he went by the screen name of Scarface and Cumba Johnny. His name was Albert Gonzalez, and he was making money or stealing money doing the CVV1 hack. So one day he's standing at an ATM in broad daylight, and he's putting one white counterfeit card in after another, pulling $20 bills out. Just so happens, across the street, two cops are sitting there, and they start to notice this kid. Walks up on Albert. Albert's wearing a disguise, a wig. Albert falls apart and flips. So Albert flips, he goes to work for the Secret Service. Albert comes back into ShadowCrew, and he takes over. And he tells the community, hey, in order to remain safe, we need to make sure we're using this VPN. That way everything's, safe and secure. Turns out the VPN's owned by the United States Secret Service, and that's where, if you read the indictments, that's where the $4 million comes from. That was the amount of stolen information that went through the VPN during those months of investigation. Secret Service was able to get addresses, names. The reason the Secret Service was created was to protect the nation's monetary supply. So, of course, cybercrime, everything's transitioning over to online payments and everything else. Of course, they are going to take a role in that. October 26, 2004 was when ShadowCrew was shut down. Cumba Johnny, Albert Gonzalez, had called for everyone to be online at about the same time. And the idea was they would swoop in and get everyone. They arrested 26 people across 6 countries in 6 hours. I avoided the arrest because I simply left ShadowCrew before the implementation of the VPN. I was online, and I ended up on ShadowCrew, and the site had been changed. All of a sudden, you didn't go to the ShadowCrew forums. There was this page of this guy behind bars. And it was this message of, you are no longer safe in the shadows. We advise you to report to your nearest United States Secret Service field office and turn yourself in. Well, I'm not about to do that. So there was all this going on. I was living under an assumed identity in Charleston, South Carolina. I was very hard to locate. I ended up getting access to the California State Death Index. I was like, well, I wonder if you can file tax returns on dead people. And it turns out you can. Tax return identity theft is what they called it. I would file tax returns from Sunday through Wednesday. Thursday, I'd plot a map of ATMs. Friday and Saturday, I'd cash out. I'd have the returns deposited on prepaid debit cards. Typically cash out in the range of $160,000, $180,000 a week, and stole a lot of money. And that's when you learn how to launder money. I was married for 9 years and lied to my wife. I lied to her every day, every day. Took her 3 years to find out I was a crook. Next 6 years were me saying, I've stopped, will stop, going to stop. And she leaves me after 9 years. I get depressed. That fear of being abandoned becomes real. I caused it. Yeah, I caused it, but it was still real. Walking around the house all day, just crying, depressed. From there, it leads into ShadowCrew. And what happens was, I was always this clean-cut criminal. I didn't start drinking until I was 34. Well, my life, I never drank before that. I'm literally that guy that walks into a strip club and falls in love with the first stripper that he sees. Her name was Elizabeth. Elizabeth didn't know what I did for a living. I had lied to her too. But I ended up getting engaged to her. But I retired. I stepped out of ShadowCrew April 14th of 2004. Stateside, I had probably $250,000 in cash, and went through, in the space of just a few months, went through all of that. So October rolls around, ShadowCrew gets busted. I don't have any cash, and I wanted to keep up that facade. So the only thing, because of ShadowCrew being busted, you didn't know who to trust anymore. The only thing I could rely on, criminal-wise, was running counterfeit cashier's checks, which I had religiously for years screamed at people not to do that. February 8th, 2005, I was supposed to pick up a couple of Tiffany diamond rings, totaled like $19,000. I was in Charleston, South Carolina. I had waited for the UPS driver to drive up. I met him at the drop address, got out of my vehicle, tell the driver, you've got a package for me. In this case, the driver said, yes, I do. Can I see your driver's license? And I pulled out a driver's license. It was my driver's license because I didn't have the ability to get a fake one. He handed me the package. I handed him a counterfeit cashier's check. I turn around, take 3 steps. There's the FBI, guns drawn. In walk these 2 Secret Service agents. They sit down. They look at me and said, we'd like to talk to you about some stolen credit cards. And they took over the investigation. So they asked me about some credit cards. I really don't tell them anything. One agent looks at me, he's like, well, we got your laptop. I was like, yep. And then he looks at me and he's like, well, is there anything you could do for us? I think the state had me under like 30 different indictments. I think the total was like $327,000 was the bond they wanted. Somebody up in Washington called whoever they needed to call and got the bond reduced to $1,000. I walk out, it's like midnight. First call I make is to Elizabeth. I'm out. And she says, I'll be there. She pulls up in a limousine, gets out, pops the trunk, gets these 2 plastic storage containers out full of my clothes, drops on the pavement, comes over, hugs me, call me later, gets in the car, leaves. I'm standing next to a Secret Service agent, and this guy looks at me, he's like, is that your fiance? I'm like, yeah. He's like, man, I am so sorry. And of course that relationship fell apart. The Secret Service field office is out of Columbia, South Carolina. They put me up in a suite, not suite, but pay-per-week hotel, and I start to work for them. So working for the Secret Service, it was typically 4 to 6 hours a day. I was paid $350 a week, plus they took care of rent and stuff like that. They had me hooked up to a laptop. The laptop was hooked up to a 50-inch plasma monitor mounted on the wall. 2 agents in the room at the same time. They were at a desktop computer next to mine, and the job was for me to educate them on cybercrime and also for me to help out with investigations. So target people, surf the forums, basically be Gollum again. Target people for investigations. And that's what I did. Ultimately, Operation Anglerfish, it arrests John Giannone, it arrests a few other decently sized people.
Eventually, the Secret Service agents, they were monitoring me. They got bored.
Because a lot of it's just monotonous. I'm bullshitting around with other criminals, developing relationships with those guys. On my laptop, they had Camtasia and Spectre Pro, so it recorded all keystrokes, and it also took snapshots of the screen every, I think, 15 or 30 seconds. All of that data, everything they were capturing, went on a DVD on a spindle, is what happened, all right? At the same time, I'm the guy that I've got an ego. I realized that, okay, all that data, no one's going to go through those DVDs. No one's really cataloging any of that bullshit. I can pretty much do what I want. So I start committing crime.
So I was committing tax return and identity theft, credit theft, and various other crimes.
For 10 months, I around, rip them off, screw them over.
So Operation Rolling Stone comes around. That's that operation where they were supposed to arrest some of the people that I had been targeting.
One of the guys that they were arresting, I had taught that kid how to do tax return fraud.
Turns out that the night before, he had loaded up a U-Haul full of stuff. And that stuff was evidently a lot of the evidence they would need to charge the guy.
So they come back to me, did you talk to anybody? And I'm like, nope. Well, we're going to make you take a polygraph. And as soon as they said that, I'm like, I'm not taking a polygraph. Call my lawyer. So my lawyer gets on the phone, and I'm on the phone with him. He's like, Brett, did you do anything? I was like, yeah. And he was like, well, you don't have to take the polygraph. And I was like, well, that's a good thing. And he's like, but if you don't, they're going to throw you back in jail. So I take the polygraph, fail it miserably. A subsequent search of the apartment unveils a lot of stuff. And I had in the apartment. Had money, had cards, had stolen identities, all that stuff. And I didn't want them to find that. They revoked my bond that night. So they revoked bond, threw me back in the county jail. Week after that, the state judge reinstates my bond. No one calls the Secret Service to tell them that. I walk out. I met with my mom. My mom's outside waiting on me. And I looked at her, I was like, I can't stay. She was like, what? So I take off on a cross-country run. I had a truck, get in the truck, head west on I-20. No idea where the hell I'm going to go. I get to Dallas, rented a room for 2 weeks, started doing tax fraud out of the local Kinko's. The night everything funded, 67 cards funded, I ended up with, I think, like $130,000 is what I ended up with in cash. I drove down Route 66, visited Roswell, New Mexico, ended up in Las Vegas, stole another $160,000, $170,000 out of ATMs through tax fraud there. Went out to LA, stole another 160 grand, come back to the hotel, sign on to cartersmarket.com that morning, and I'm United States Most Wanted, Secret Service Most Wanted. And I sat there looking at it. And that's the first time my name had been mentioned on a criminal forum. My picture had been posted, everything else. I sat there just stunned looking at it. And finally I said out loud, I was like, well, Brett, you've made the United States Most Wanted list. What are you going to do now? And I said out loud, I'm going to Disney World. So that's what I did. I checked out of the hotel there in Vegas, drove to Disney World, got my year pass at Disney and Universal. And I was like, you know, I can lay low. I can enjoy the parks. There's a lot of tourists in the area. I can hide there. Rented a timeshare with cash, bought electronics, everything else. And the idea was, well, I'll just hold up here for a year. Then I'll bug out to Florianopolis, Brazil, and set up shop again and do it all again. It was September 16th, 2006. And I heard this knock at the door. Got my ass out of bed, looked through the peephole, another Secret Service agent, and an Orange County sheriff. Would you guys like to come in? And he's like, well, we need to put you in cuffs first. I was like, yeah, I figured. My understanding is they used a triggerfish. Back then it was called triggerfish. Today it's called stingray to locate me. That is a box that simulates a cell phone tower. Back then, I don't know what it is now, what the tech is now, but back then it could locate you within a 7-foot radius. I'm arrested. I'm thrown in the Orange County jail. Ultimately, the state charges were dropped in favor of the federal charges: conspiracy, forgery, aggravated identity theft, and multiple counts of all of those. And it was like 75 months. When I got to Big Spring, Texas, at that point you understand exactly what prison is. The inmates run the prison, not the guards. When you get to prison, you're met by your race. I'm met at the door by the treasurer of the Aryan Brotherhood. He looks at me, he's like, how many more white guys come in? I'm like, I don't know, 3 or 4. Next question is, what are you in here for? My answer is, computer crime. And I smile. No, you don't say computer crime in prison. That doesn't mean hacking, credit card theft, all this bullshit. When you say computer crime, that means child predator. So he's looking at me. He calls his big buddies. They circle around. What'd you say you're in here for? So I tell them, you know, I'm in here for this. And they're like, okay, sounds good. You still said computer crime. Now, the way it works, they will not attack you until they know you are that predator. At that point, that's your ass. Or it takes the guards telling them that you're that guy. Well, none of the guards told them anything. Spent 2 years at Big Spring, and at Big Spring is where I realized that the only person that put me in prison was me. I ended up serving about 7.5 years total. Anyone that commits cybercrime or computer-related crimes, usually you're under 3 years or 5 years supervised release. And during that time, you're not allowed to touch a computer, or there are certain guidelines that you have to have. I was released from prison, went to the halfway house. Didn't have a job. I had job offers. Deloitte, no before, couldn't take them. I asked about fast food. No, that's a computer. Can't touch a computer. So I couldn't get a job. I was going broke. My probation officer had given me permission to get a cell phone. And I had signed on to plentyoffish.com. About the same time, my wife, now Michelle, first date we had, first real date, she asked me 10 minutes into it, she's like, what's the worst thing you've ever done? I was like, I just got out of federal prison. She's like, no, seriously. And I told her all about me. She decides to keep dating me. Finally, I get a job. The only job I could get was pushing a lawnmower. Bust my ass, 10 hours a day, $400 a week. Job ends because it gets cold, grass stops growing, and I get it in my head. I was like, I got to do something to show her I'm worth it. Get on the dark web, get some stolen credit cards, start ordering food. So I get caught doing that. Go back to prison. The lesson I learned was Michelle didn't need me for me. She just wanted me for me. Got out of prison. Got married to her shortly after that. I ended up reaching out to this guy, FBI agent. And I sent him a message. I was like, hey, man, he had arrested a lot of people that I knew. I said, I think you did an outstanding job. You got nothing but my respect. And at the end of it, I was like, by the way, I'd like to be legal. That man responded within 2 hours. Within 2 hours, he gave me references, he gave me advice. That led to Carice Hendrick being the first person that hired me to speak for the Card Not Present group. AARP has me as an ambassador for them. I work hard every single day. I wake up every morning to protect people from that person that I used to be. Today I lead a very blessed life that I don't deserve. But I'm grateful for it. Every single day, I regret who I have been. I regret every single instance of that, of the people that I knew that I victimized, the people that I didn't know that I victimized, of the people that loved me, that trusted me, that put faith in me, every single day. And the only thing I can do, you can't fix that, man. There's no fixing that. Cybercrime is the third largest economy on the planet. You've got China, you've got the United States, you've got cybercrime to the tune of $10 trillion a year. It's a booming industry. When I was a criminal, you had to understand every single dynamic or aspect of the crime you were committing. Your own security, the company's security, how to make fake IDs, run drop addresses, launder money, everything else. That's changed. Now you have fraud as a service. Every single product and service is off the shelf. A criminal now doesn't have to understand any aspect of the crime. They can immediately buy tutorials, take live instruction classes, buy anything that they need online, and immediately start being successful and profitable at crime because of that, because of the ease of access of Telegram, things like that. You see crime continue to explode. It absolutely has to do with the pandemic as well. You know, during the pandemic, we saw a lot of criminals committing unemployment fraud, PPP fraud, stuff like that.
What advice do you have for the general public on how to best protect themselves from cybercrime?
Okay, let's talk about that threat landscape. You got mass media out there. They paint computer criminals or attackers as hackers, computer geniuses. No, it's not computer geniuses. It's the stuff we know about, we're not doing anything about, that creates that opportunity for attack, all right? 90% plus of every single attack uses a known exploit. It's something you know about. It's something you've been told about that you're not doing anything about that opens that door. 56% of companies experience a breach because of third-party access. Your network's only as strong as the weakest device which accesses it. Over 41% of every single router on the planet has a default password. Oh, shit. And that's not even the big one. The big one, 80% of every breach begins with a phishing attack. What makes phishing so important? Why is it so widely used? A phishing attack is a social engineering attack. It boils down to how good of a social engineer am I, a liar, am I in convincing you to do that thing. They know what it takes to manipulate you into giving up information, access, data, or cash. Why would I try to brute force past a firewall if I can send an email to someone sitting behind that? That creates that threat landscape. For individuals, it's not that difficult. It begins with freezing your credit. Credit freezes became free September 2018. Today, the population, 12%. 12%. The other 88% are victims waiting to happen. All right? So freeze the credit of every single person in the house, including children. Children are the number one victims of identity theft. 1 in 4, 25%. All right? So freeze the credit. That's free. You have to contact all 3 credit bureaus. Do you use the same password and, log in across multiple websites? Chances are you do. 80% of the population does. So good password security. What does that look like? That's up to you. You can use a password manager, you can use passkeys. I'm not against a password notebook as long as it's not at your desk at work. So these things are important. From there, you can look at multi-factor authentication, things like that, but it begins with freezing credit, monitor accounts, place alerts, good password security, and then you go from there. If you've got just a modicum of security in place, chances are I'm going to find an easier target, all right? You've still got the investment schemes, you've got the romance schemes that are out there. What's interesting is over time, credit card theft is still huge. Make no mistake about that. But there's almost a shift in the mindset of online criminals where they're going more toward the scam environment. They're more reliant on manipulating through that lie or social engineer. They're more reliant on tricking that victim into sending cash out instead of doing account takeovers and things like that. Trust is usually established through technology, tools. So they'll use spoofed phone calls. You won't see the phone number they're calling from. You'll see your bank, the FBI, Sheriff's Department, Social Security Administration, something like that. The idea is to try to get that victim to do a knee-jerk reaction. Oh, and click. Well, you're done at that point. This morning, I got an email as I was walking here from Coinbase. Someone logged into your account. I'm like, oh, now you open up the email. Someone has accessed your account. They've logged in. Then it's got the link. Do you click on the link? No, by God, you do not. You close out that email. You go to your browser. You type in coinbase.com. I logged in. No one had accessed my account, but I did change my password. So that's something you got to understand. You know, whatever you do, report those crimes to law enforcement. If you don't report these crimes, people like me, we get away with it, and we keep going. I grew up knowing how to do insurance fraud, faking stolen cars, charity fraud. So that's the life I grew up in. When I became an adult, I had the opportunity to choose that different path, and I didn't. I found eBay and liked eBay a lot. I was like, there has to be some way to make money on this. Didn't know how.
Began doing eBay fraud around the year 1997.
I used to watch Bill O'Reilly on Inside Edition a lot, and he had a show that night, and they were profiling Beanie Babies. The one they were profiling was Peanut the Royal Blue Elephant, selling for $1,500. So I skipped class the next day, go around to all these little Hallmark short stores looking for Peanut, but they had these gray ones. The exact same elephant, just a different color. Had these gray ones for $8. Found a picture of a real one online. I posted it. I used a picture of a real Peanut Beanie Baby. So this woman wins the bid. I don't want to be on the defense of the conversation. I want her on the defense of that. So I send her a message. Hey, you win. Congratulations. By the way, we've never done any business before. I don't even know if I can trust you. What I need you to do, go down to the U.S. Postal Service, pick up a couple of money orders. They're issued by the United States government. That protects you. More importantly, that protects me. You send me those, I'll send you your animal with the U.S. Postal money orders. The reason I chose that is you could actually cash those money orders out at the post office, all right? And because that victim wanted that Beanie Baby so bad, they believe that allows me to establish that trust and defraud them. She believed that, sends me the money orders, I cash them out, send her the creature in the mail. I did that crime under my own name, dumbass that I am. Immediately get this phone call. This is not what I ordered. And that's the first online crime that I committed. I ended up defrauding a woman of $1,500. A lot of them, they get so exasperated, they throw their hands in the air, they walk away. You don't hear from them again. So that's the first online crime I committed and got away with it. And it emboldened me. You keep going. I was a piece of shit. And if you understand that, not just about me, but about these guys that are online doing this shit, you can probably protect yourself better.
My name is Robert Mazer. I spent 2 years undercover laundering tens of millions of dollars for Pablo Escobar's cartel. This is how crime works. Money laundering enables cartels to produce the most lethal thing that they produce around the world, and that's corruption. It enables them to be able to control countries, presidents of countries. Operation Sea Chase was a multi-agency task force to prosecute the biggest money launderers of the Medellin cartel. Most of the people I dealt with were high-level drug traffickers who had hundreds of millions of dollars. I'm doing this interview in silhouette because two agencies and an intelligence agency informed me that the Medellin cartel issued a contract on my life. I spent a year and a half putting together what I think is one of the more sophisticated fronts used in undercover. I built the persona of Robert Musella. I dressed the part, certainly had the lifestyle, drove a Rolls-Royce, Mercedes, Jaguar. I was embedded in real businesses. Had an air charter service with a private jet. We had a jewelry chain with 30 locations on the East Coast. A lot of cash goes through the Diamond District every single day. So if you've got those kinds of businesses, you have a very good excuse for where the cash came from. I was embedded in an investment company, a mortgage brokerage business, and even a brokerage firm with a seat on the New York Stock Exchange. And then I and my partner began a 2-year infiltration of the Medellin cartel and the banks that were supporting them. One of the keys to doing undercover work is to build your undercover persona to have as many traits as you do in common. Robert Musella was from Staten Island. I'm from Staten Island. Robert Musella was a businessman. I have a business background. I didn't fake accents, fake anything. I was always just me. The first person I met that was working within the Medellin cartel is a gentleman by the name of Gonzalo Mora, a small-time money launderer who had an import-export business, but the capacity he had to launder was probably limited to about $50,000 a week at best. We had my partner, Emir, deal with him and simply say, listen, my boss handles a lot of this, but he never wants to meet you. He wants to stay in the shadows. But if you could ever convince him to come out of the shadows, the rivers would open and you'd be able to launder untold amounts of money. By the end of that 6 months, Gonzalo Mora was banging on the door to meet me. You know, it's always best to play hard to get. I also knew these people have a sixth sense. If you're afraid of a dog, they know that. You're the first one they bite. I didn't want to get bit. So I knew that I would be working against myself and undermining my cause if I showed any fear whatsoever. And I told him eventually, listen, I have to get these people to understand that they need to let me invest some of their money. Your only responsibility is to introduce me to them. If I succeed, we'll even do business bigger. He felt compelled to make the introductions, and then I started to climb up the ladder to meet bigger and bigger people. You know, money launderers, like I played the role of, are basically operating what's called the black money market. It's an informal banking system that's made available to people who operate through the underground. So as a black money market operator, I have a supply of dollars. My supply comes from drug traffickers. Now I have to find people who have a demand for dollars. People who want to buy dollars are oftentimes importers around the world who otherwise have to go through their central bank and spend 25% of their money to officially get dollars. I could sell it to them for 10%. My traffickers, in many instances, wanted Colombian pesos. So the best people I could sell those dollars to were Colombian importers. All I have to do is swap. So I had supply clients, traffickers, and demand clients. But most often the money would wind up into bank accounts controlled by the cartel in Panama. And from there, they distributed it around the world wherever they wanted to hide it. Well, sometimes the money had to be used to buy planes. Like there was a guy, his responsibility was acquiring the aircraft and trucks and things like that that the cartel needed. So he basically was the buyer of the cartel's Air Force. So I dealt with him because he needed money in order to buy the specific planes they were looking for, which were Rockwell 1000s and Rockwell 980s. Some money is smuggled out of the United States down to Colombia, and it's used to make payoffs to people in the military or prosecutors or politicians or whoever's help they need to buy. Most of the money is in 5, 10s, and 20s. That's because people using illegal drugs buy it with 5, 10s, and 20s. That gets collected by people who have a responsibility here for the cartels to do nothing other than collect money. They try not to have traffickers and money handlers in the same place. Too much asset to potentially be lost. So the dollars generally would come to me in suitcases, duffel bags, boxes. New York was a key point. You get $1 million, $2 million per delivery. I generally had runners who picked it up and brought it. You don't usually get the guy who really controls the safe on the street. The way it works is we get the information from Gonzalo Mora. So he might give us a phone number in the form of an invoice number. He might say that, you need to get in touch with Guapo, and he's going to have 250 boxes. It's 250,000. They generally like to meet in a public area, so it might be at a McDonald's. They sit down, not much gets said, pushes the keys across the table. It's in the trunk. Amir goes and gets the money. It's usually wrapped in rubber bands in blocks of 5,000 and 10,000, depending upon denominations. A lot of people say, wow, isn't it tempting? You've got all these millions and millions of dollars and it's in cash. There's unfortunately been people in just about every agency that has fallen victim into a slippery slope of greed. My motivation was information became my heroin. If I couldn't get the next big piece of information and I couldn't risk more than I did to get the last piece of information, I felt as though I wasn't accomplishing my mission. Yeah, I was addicted, but I was addicted to information. Layering is a process by which a series of corporations, usually offshore entities, are used to continue to receive what initially started off maybe as a suitcase full of cash. The way we layered, the money would first be put into a certificate of deposit in Luxembourg in the name of an offshore entity. That money was used by the bank as collateral for a loan in a different part of the world. So let's say the loan was in Paris, and that was to a Gibraltar corporation. And then that Gibraltar corporation would transfer the funds to Panama, and then from there to accounts controlled by the drug traffickers. And so the purpose that you use layering for is to just confuse the route in which the money is being moved. In order for anyone to trace the money backward, you have to first pierce the corporate veil in Panama and bank secrecy laws. Then you have to pierce the same in France. Then you have to pierce the same in Luxembourg. A lot of times what they do, if they don't want to deal with a person like me, they will use an army of couriers, call them Smurfs, the little blue guys, Smurfs running all over. We kind of dub them Smurfs because, let's say there's 10 of them. Their job every day is to go to meet with their money contact. And that guy may have $500,000 in the trunk. And each of them gets $50,000 and a map that tells them where it is locally they can go to use cash to buy MoneyGrams, cashier's checks, money orders, traveler's checks. They'll buy a money order for $987.25 to try to make it look like it's for a payment. Leave the payee blank. They generally don't want to buy anything over $3,000. So at the end of the day, $500,000 that filled the trunk was now a stack maybe 8 inches high of money orders, traveler's checks. There were times when those were offered to me to then take it from there and launder it. That was safety for them because we were not having direct contact with their main money people. We were just getting a FedEx box with $500,000 in money orders. I think the biggest deposit was somewhere around 2.1 million. There was a time that I met in Paris with Pablo Escobar's main lawyer, a guy named Santiago Uribe, and some other people that worked directly with Pablo. He sent Uribe to assess our money laundering processes. And at the end of that meeting, we came to an agreement. We would receive in a relatively short period of time, $100 million that they wanted to put into a nest egg in Europe in case they had to flee. So when we get back from Europe, we started getting deliveries, 1 million in the morning, 2 million in the afternoon. I had told the people who were doing surveillance that they needed to be really careful, and we needed to try to keep it as light as we could because they would have counter surveillance out there. And one of the people who I dealt with, a person who met with Pablo Escobar, often told me, make sure your people look on the street for gringos, white guys, who are in their late 20s, early 30s, in good shape, wearing jeans, pullover shirts with collars, solid color, jogging shoes, fanny packs, that's where their guns are hidden. Those are los feos, the ugly ones. That's informally what people in the cartel call the feds. So I never used to want to go into an office, but this was getting very important, so I met with the people who were going to do the surveillance, and there was a room full of gringos with jeans, pullover shirts that were solid with collars, and they had fanny packs. And I tried to convince them that that was a uniform that everybody was looking for, but egos are such in law enforcement that sometimes people don't want to take that advice. So anyway, the surveillance got burned. And the next thing that happened is that my partner, Amir Abreu, received a phone call from Gonzalo Mora. And in the background was a screaming voice of Gerardo Moncada, Pablo Escobar's main manager, who was screaming that Musella, I, had to be a DEA undercover agent because they saw all the feds there and all deals from here on were off. And I had to talk myself out of that. I guess the point is that there are a lot of different moving parts to these undercover operations. And it's pretty easy for any one of us to do something that might potentially endanger somebody else on the team. All of the traffickers said to me, you know, I love your money laundering system, but the end payout is US dollar checks from accounts that are in the United States. We want you to open up US dollar accounts in Panama. Panama uses the US dollar more than it does its own currency. They know that secrecy is big in Panama by corporations, by banks. It's harder for DEA to get the information concerning the accounts. But what they told me also was, listen, we want your accounts in Panama because we own General Manuel Noriega, and he will not touch any of your accounts because you're with us. So now I have to open up an account in Panama. I happened to be driving past a branch in Tampa of the Bank of Credit and Commerce International, the 7th largest privately held bank in the world. It was a big gold sign. I would have never walked in there if it wasn't for that. And they said, well, we'll give you a meeting if you can give us a resume. I had a fully verifiable resume, and I had bank accounts with millions of dollars in it, all of which the bank in particular wanted to see before they opened up to me and explained to me how they laundered money for many people in organized crime. And I said to him, all of my clients are from Medellin, Colombia. They operate businesses here in the States that are very sensitive. And it's my job to very cautiously help them to move capital across borders. So he goes, well, that's the black money market. We have plenty of customers who deal in that business. He said, you know, yeah, Panama is where you want to be. There's a lot of hands in which these checks go through. And sometimes mistakes can be made. And in fact, that's the way I got really inside the Bank of Credit and Commerce International. That got me into the inner circle of dirty officers in BCCI, and then I went on to meet more than a dozen of them. The number one person who managed my accounts, a gentleman by the name of Amjad Awan, he managed accounts for people who ran countries, for Manuel Noriega. He helped launder Noriega's drug profits from the protection he sold to the Medellin cartel. And during that time, we recorded about 1,200 conversations, all of which were used as the cornerstones of the prosecution of not just drug traffickers and money launderers, but senior officials of the Bank of Credit and Commerce International. I needed to coax the conversations into the areas where I was exposing their true intent, their involvement in criminality. I couldn't allow them to dance around issues. You have to try to get a way to have the conversation. So one of the things that I used during that time frame, one of the most famous businessmen at the time in the late 80s was a guy by the name of Lee Iacocca. He ran Chrysler. Everybody knew who he was. And so when I would talk to people, especially at the bank, I would say, you know, if my clients came in this room, you might mistake them as being Lee Iacocca. The big difference is they don't sell cars, they sell coke. I dealt with dirty bankers. I dealt with lawyers in Switzerland who formed corporations to hide the source of our funds. I dealt with attorneys in Panama, people who ran financial service corporations that do nothing other than form tens of thousands of corporations for people all over the world. They provide nominee directors that hide the beneficial ownership of accounts and the control of corporations. All of these people are intermediaries who the underworld counts on. There were other people, real money launderers at that time, who were sending what they claimed to be precious metals in and out of the United States, which actually was lead that was covered by gold. And that was their cover for why they were depositing cash, and were not bashful about it, talking to the bank and saying, you know, this is a cash generating business. You know, if you have enough that's believable, it's amazing how quickly they'll convince themselves that you are who you say you are. June of 1988. I was told that it would be the first week of October that the operation would be taken down. I've got 2 years worth of work to do, and I got to get it done in about 3 months. You know, so many times these undercover operations result in indictments, but the bad guys, they're in countries that do not offer extradition. Colombia was one. Someone suggested, well, why don't we have some kind of a personal event? One of the agents said, you know, well, they obviously appear to like Bob. How about a wedding? So we put this together for a supposed wedding in Innisbrook, which is a country club. This got personal. You know, in some instances, children of future defendants were part of the wedding, wives. And the night before, one of my informants went around to the defendants and said, hey, Bob doesn't know this. We're going to have a bachelor party. The cars will be here soon. The arrest team's there. They arrest them. Everybody was in disbelief. And the case concluded with the arrest of about 85 individuals, the collection of fines and forfeitures of about $600 million, and the seizure of about 3,000 pounds of cocaine. Ultimately, the bank imploded on the night of the arrests. You know, it was all high fives. They wanted to go out and have a celebratory gathering. I wanted nothing to do with that whatsoever. I was emotionally exhausted. I first learned about the contract on my life about 30 days after the undercover Operation Sea Chase was over. The longest trial lasted 6 months. I was on the witness stand. I could see the hatred in their eyes, even more so in the eyes of their family members who were there. No doubt, you know, they didn't see me as a person who was just doing their job. They saw me as a person who tricked them. You know, but I never tricked anybody into doing anything other than trusting me. Nobody in there did anything that they hadn't done before. After I testified, my family and I rented a motorhome. We went into the mountains, got away from everybody, and tried to heal. There was a pager number, an 800 number that they could call, the office could call and leave me a message, and occasionally I would check. And I got word that the jury had convicted every single person of virtually all accounts. I went back to the campsite by a river and just sat there thinking about it. And it occurred to me that it was so surreal that I had done the same things that the bankers had done, and I was getting awards, and they were about to go to jail for a long time. And I don't take what I did lightly. Some people think it's a sign of weakness. You know, I did drop a tear or two that day. I kind of think that was good, because I want a government with conscience. I don't want people high-fiving. It's unfortunate, but the law enforcement community and the private sector responsible for trying to attack money laundering have been highly unsuccessful. The United Nations on Drugs and Crime estimates that roughly $400 billion is generated each year from the sale of illegal drugs. What I really do believe needs to be done, you have to understand there are two different sides of banking. There's the sales side and the compliance side. Sales side brings in the accounts. Compliance in an unhealthy bank only does the background to make sure they're not dealing with a bad guy. That needs to be brought together. I'm suggesting it only on accounts that have $5 million or more that have been received in a year. I think that the account relationship manager that brought the account in should have to file with the bank a sworn statement affirming that they've asked certain questions that if you ask them would expose whether or not it is an account that's being run by front people. Those questions don't get asked, and they don't get asked now because the sales side always tells the compliance side, if I ask those questions, we won't get this business, because they don't want to answer those questions. You know, we have a joint terrorism task force run by the FBI, but is also participated in by, I don't know how many hundred agencies. There should be a joint money laundering task force that does the exact same thing. You know, there has been an evolution of cryptocurrency. There are people who've been involved in the drug world who have used cryptocurrency. Unlike cash, you can follow crypto. The other problem you have with crypto is you only need to look at Bitcoin and see that, unlike the US dollar, its value is not stable. I don't think it's really ready for the big time in the drug world. What is big? Gold refining in the Middle East, Dubai. That's big. I retired from undercover work after the second operation when I almost got killed, and that was in the late 90s. I'm extraordinarily grateful to have the platform from which I get the opportunity to speak. And that platform is first a book called The Infiltrator that became a New York Times bestseller, and the basis for a film by the same name starring Bryan Cranston. And then subsequently, a book I wrote called The Betrayal, a nonfiction book about the second undercover operation that I did. But as long as I've got that platform, I'm going to do everything I can to try to share information that can in some way try to help us with the problem we face with this massive illegal drug problem in our country and around the world.
My name's Jeff Turner. I printed over $1 million in U.S. banknotes, and this is how crime works. I've been called the Picasso of counterfeiting. From my perspective, it wasn't that hard to do it, if that makes sense. It just took a lot of trial and error, basically. The bills just progressively got better and better until eventually got caught, and the Secret Service said the bills I were making were the best they've seen in 25 years. I started counterfeiting when I kind of found myself in a desperate financial situation. I wrecked a work truck, so I lost my job. And, you know, I had a newborn baby at home. The lease was up in our house. So I was just kind of, you know, in a desperate spot. I was just trying to think of some way to get my family back on their feet, you know. And counterfeiting just ended up being like the safest, easiest way. The majority of the money I printed was the 96 series $100 bill. I also counterfeited some of the 2013, the new blue notes, but really that was more of like a hobby for me, like just kind of a challenge. The longest process to start counterfeiting was making the digital files. I would say I spent 2 months of just editing these images. Really, Wikipedia has pretty high resolution photos in their stock, and I broke the image down to multiple layers. So I would have one image of just the background color. I'd jumble up the serial numbers. I knew I needed to find a real thin paper that was opaque enough to where you couldn't see the strip and watermark through the face of the bill. I went through rice paper, vellum paper, tracing paper, you know, toilet paper, wrappers on toilet paper. I ended up finding that Bible paper was perfect. Bible paper glows a dull purple, just like money does. I would acquire the Bible paper by going into like bookstores and just kind of taking out the blank pages. Inevitably, I ran out of bookstores in Knoxville. I would coat the bills with a matte lacquer spray can, which basically enabled the counterfeit detection pens to mark yellow. I would also use invisible ink UV pen to draw an invisible line over the strip. I also found a certain type of iridescent green eyeshadow that I would basically paint on to the 100 in the bottom corner to kind of replicate the color shifting ink. One cashier would run her fingernail along Benjamin Franklin's shirt to kind of feel the rigid texture. I ended up going to like a Hobby Lobby and I found like a fine tip glue pen. It would dry and give a little texture to a shirt. The 3D security ribbon on the modern $100 bill was hard to crack. The Bureau of Engraving and Printing kind of outsources a company to produce the paper and some of the security features. And I was able to find the patent rights, so it's like it basically explained how to do it. The trial and error was definitely frustrating. When I first started counterfeiting, you know, I would just experiment and I'd mess up 5 for every one that I made well. Towards the end, I could make a perfect counterfeit $100 bill in probably 5 or 10 minutes. I've had a few printers kind of break on me. Sometimes the paper would just get so jammed up. It's not so much noisy because I'm using digital printers, but the matte lacquer spray smells really bad. So a lot of times, like maids at hotels would come into my room and thinking we're like huffing paint or like something, I'd have to say, oh, my wife spilled nail polish, or, you know, just make up these little lies. But eventually I rented a house and I had ventilation fans that would suck the matte lacquer out the window. So I could kind of spray the bills in front of this exhaust fan that it kind of sucked it out the window. There weren't really like big stockpiles of counterfeit money. I would try to like essentially launder the money every day. You know, so I'd print maybe 2,000, 5,000 in the morning and early afternoon, and then I'd try to break all those bills before the end of the night. There was probably like 10 or 20 of like the big corporations, retail, grocery stores, you know, Walmart type stores, and those were the best to break the bills at. I also sold bills to people. 25 cents on the dollar was kind of the going rate. If I was breaking a bill in a store, I would try to go to female cashiers, and if I sent women in with the bills, I would tell them to go to male cashiers. When I would break a bill, I'd give them the exact coinage to kind of distract them a little bit. The majority of your amateur type counterfeiters get kind of called out at the register, and, you know, they'll get a license plate number or something. And I would like always park my car far away so they could never get my license plate. I steered away from self-checkout machines because they were just too hard to beat. And some of them even have like photographic software where it just analyzes like the microprinting and all that stuff. In the beginning, I was definitely nervous because I spent so much time, you know, perfecting these bills that I would notice any little, you know, error or anything like that. I think I've got an attention to detail that most people probably don't have. And, you know, the knowledge I have for the security features, I study extensively. There was a few times that I would go to the same grocery store, and it turns out that the bills I'd spent last week, they found out about them. But really, most of the time, when a cashier, even if the cashier kind of knows it's fake, they usually give it back to you. Over the 2 years that I was counterfeiting, I probably only had like maybe 3 or 4 cashiers turn me down. And I was spending, you know, thousands of dollars every day. Luckily for me, they only had, I think, like 12 surveillance videos of me. So I was pretty good about kind of staying anonymous. There was a be on the lookout for me and my wife breaking a bill at a specific store. They didn't know my name, though. It was just a picture. The Secret Service has the capability of kind of building cases on people, but as far as local police, I mean, they can't really do much about it, you know. Knoxville has a lot of dealers from out of town. Basically, drugs are more expensive in Knoxville than they are in Detroit or Chicago or Cleveland or Atlanta. So a lot of people kind of go to these mid-level cities to sell their drugs because they're, you know, you can get a brick in Detroit for like $25,000 and then cut it and go sell it for, you know, $100,000 in Knoxville. I was addicted to drugs at the time, so a lot of it was buying drugs with the bills. A few dealers I was honest with, and I would say, this is what I do. And I ended up selling some bills to a drug dealer from Cleveland. But there was a couple cases of I would buy drugs from these people with the counterfeit money. And the guy that actually ended up setting me up, I probably got him for like close to $10,000 over about a month's period. And he said that it was raining one day and one of my bills got wet and the color shifting makeup smeared off. So he found out that they were fake. He was just kind of impressed and, wanted to start buying them from me. These people would drive from Knoxville up to Detroit to buy like a brick of heroin, and they would mix in like 5,000 or 10,000 of my bills when they went to their city to re-up. All different stores have their specific method of detecting counterfeit bills. And a lot of like the big retailers just use the counterfeit pens. So they typically just mark the bill and then, if it marks properly, they cash it. If someone's buying a real cheap item with a $100 bill, that's probably more reason to take a closer look at it. Like looking for the strip and the watermark, holding the bill up to the light helps. Really the best way to tell if a bill's real is like putting it in a bill validator. This is the more modern Blue Note $100 bill. If you hold the bill at a certain angle and shift it, the ink turns from a metallic green to a copper. It's used with magnetic ink. So if you fold a bill in half and set it on the table, you can actually lift it up with a neodymium magnet. There's enough magnetism to actually lift the bill up off the table. So some cashiers will scratch the shirt to feel a kind of rigid texture in the bill. The bills are printed on an intaglio press that kind of raises the ink above the paper, which gives it a certain type of texture. Bills are really hard. There's kind of like a real crisp feeling to it. Well, yeah, there is a smell to money. And my bills, I've had a couple people, if I sprayed the matte lacquer, like too soon to spending it, you know what I mean? Like a couple people would complain of a smell. I mean, they always accepted the bills because really like every security feature that a cashier would look for, my bills had. So even if they were kind of suspicious or even brought up something like the smell, they still accepted it because there was really no reason to believe it was counterfeit. It was 2019. The dealer from Cleveland, he got arrested up there. He either got caught with my counterfeit money or heroin. And, it didn't take him long to inform on me. And then from there, the Secret Service raided my hotel room. I was in the process of printing when they kicked the door in. So they found computers and printers, and I think I had like 6,400 in counterfeit bills that I tried to flush down the toilet. They pretty much caught me red-handed at that point. I was basically looking at like about 3 years, but the Secret Service came to me and basically said that if I pleaded guilty and showed them how I did everything, then they wouldn't charge my wife with anything, and they would give me cooperation credit, and they'd keep my restitution amount under $100,000. So with the cooperation, that got reduced to 10 to 16 months. The maximum sentence is 20 years. I think, white-collar criminals should still go to prison. I mean, I deserve to go, to prison. I was lucky with the amount of time that I served. It got me sober. Really, it was for the best in my particular case. There are organizations in other countries, that have taken a liking to counterfeiting. It's obviously extremely profitable. And, I've heard that a lot of counterfeits come out of Lima and, Medellin. I've seen some bills that I was told came from like South America, but the quality wasn't very good, I didn't think. It's criminal organizations in the drug trade. And just like from my experience, people who were in the drug trade, Obviously, they're opportunists. You know, if there's a way to make money any other way, from my experience, you know, they'll do it. There's a supernote, they say, most likely coming out of North Korea, produced by the North Korean government, that is indistinguishable from legitimate currency. It's supposedly has not only all the security features, but all of them done pretty flawlessly. I started counterfeiting when I was 19 years old. I read The Art of Making Money, a book about Art Williams, who was a counterfeiter up in Chicago. And that kind of gave me the original idea, but everything else was kind of like my own methods. The bills weren't super sophisticated, but they were good enough to sell. A friend of mine's dad was kind of like a connected guy in Tampa. But then my friend overdosed and died. I basically just stopped doing it. You know, at that point, I didn't want to get caught. And of course, when I started up again later on, it's all because of, you know, just a desperate financial situation that kind of, you know, I was racking my brain for any ways to make quick money. I don't think, you know, there will ever be a way to prevent counterfeiting. You know, even if it goes digital, there's still ways of counterfeiting cashless. Like a person I know was counterfeiting credit cards. The $1 million or so that I had made over my career hasn't impacted the economy much, I would say. But, you know, maybe on like the local level, it might make people lose trust in cash. In fact, a lot of stores in Knoxville don't accept $100 bills anymore. They've got little signs at like Dollar Generals and certain stores that I frequented. Obviously, you know, this whole situation kind of flipped my life upside down. You know, I'm sure it wasn't easy on my kids. You know, I had to go to prison. My wife and I are now separated. So, I mean, it's been, you know, rough on all of us. Now I am the production manager at a printing and graphics company in Knoxville. So yeah, just still printing, just not nothing illegal.
I'm Jim Browning, I'm known as a scam baiter, and I hack into scammers' CCTV, and I've managed to close down hundreds of scam call centres. This is how crime works. What I do is disrupt multi-million-dollar scams, the ringleaders exposed, and those people have an awful lot of money behind them. Why the silhouette? Well, it can be quite dangerous. You can imagine the type of things that they may decide to do to stop me. Up until recently, had a normal day job, and sometimes I would work at home, and I would constantly get the same phone calls that I think most people get, and you instantly know it's a scam. But I was getting those so often that it was interrupting my normal work. I thought, I'm an engineer, I know about computers, know about networks, maybe I can do something about this, or at least I want to find out what it is they're really after, and maybe report the people in the hope that I could stop the calls. I encountered Fairmart Travels back in 2019. They were operating a pop-up scam. I was browsing the internet. Suddenly this message pops up saying I've got a virus, and I had to call a number that locked my keyboard and mouse. And from experience, I know that that's a scam, but I deliberately called the number. They told me that they were a Microsoft affiliate and they needed access to my computer. But I have this little trick where if someone connects to my computer, I can reverse that connection, and that enables me to see their computer. And I was able to find out quite a lot of data and video and audio. Of course, the people on the end of the phone are primed to persuade you that you've got a computer problem. They will want you to, although they may not say the words, remote access to your computer, they will deliberately misdiagnose it. And to fix that problem, even though there's no problem, you would have to pay them. And it varies anywhere between maybe a few £100 up to a few £1,000. They will talk reasonably technical sounding language deliberately, but it's all just a script. Most people who are victims of that scam think that it's some friendly person trying to help them out when in fact there was nothing wrong whatsoever. It's not just done once, they're scammed multiple times after that. The setup can be very tiny. You can run a scam call center out of a hotel room. You don't need particularly expensive computers to run a scam, and I think a lot of scammers know that. And what I typically find is they will run the oldest of old computers just because they're cheap. The average scam call center has between 10 and 20 people. Fairmark Travels, they set themselves up as a travel agency. They were running out of 2 buildings in a suburb of New Delhi. In those days, the front offices were all running legitimate work, but in literally the offices behind that building, they ran a scam operation. In fact, they used the same telephone system that they did for their legitimate work, but in the background, they would run this scam call center. So they had almost a perfect setup so that if the police ever did raid the places, they could always point the police to their legitimate work. They actually recorded their phone calls, and I was able to download over 70,000 scam phone calls from other operators in that room. It did help that I could see at the supervisor's computer, so I could see the messages going from the people who actually operated the calls right back to the CEO of the company. So if you can think about it, any normal office organization, they had exactly that structure. The agents are incentivized on how much money they make, and because of that, they get a bonus at the end of the month. So they had supervisors who would tot up every agent's performance. And if you can make more than 30 successful calls, for example, you will make more money. I have seen in other operations that if you don't make your targets, typically you're out of the business completely. It was an operation that ran 24/7. They would have different shifts. So they would target Australia early in their daytime. It would move to Europe in the afternoons and evenings, and then at nighttime it would be the USA. There was another person who was the accountant for the company. They knew which channel it came from, so what sort of scam operation they were running that day, which country it involved, which currency it involved, which payment gateway it involved. He would have all of the detail of that money going into huge spreadsheets, and of course then that would be laundered elsewhere. So they had everything you would expect in a real office building. They had a HR department, quality assurance department. They would actually listen to some of the scam phone calls and feed back to the agents how they could run the scam better. I was able to see exactly what the CEO was doing because there was a CCTV camera in his office. It was the only one with audio. And he would spend a small portion of the day looking after his legitimate business, the travel agency business. But an awful long part of the day was spent making sure that the next type of scam was going to happen. I did hear him discussing an Amazon scam and how he would set that up. Things like how they would process the money were discussed. Occasionally I will encounter networks of money launderers, and if they're asking victims to transfer money, normally it will be to a bank account in their own country. And the reason for that is it's much, much more simple for money to go out of a victim account into a local bank account, a reasonably local bank account. But of course, it hasn't got back to the scammer yet, so there has to be a network of people who will take that initial transfer and move it between a number of countries. An average scam will have at least one money mule in the UK, one money mule at least in a different country other than India, typically Thailand, and between them they will move money between jurisdictions. I have seen Telegram and Skype groups specifically set up to allow money transfers to happen. So I know with Fairmark Technologies, I was able to see exactly where the money went when it came between the victims and right through to the company. So I could see as each payment was being made, there was an individual transaction in PayPal which went to a company called Adrit Technologies. And Amit Chauhan is the CEO of, or was the CEO of Adrit Technologies. So I got a direct payment link between the victims and his company. And I could tell that he was making at least tens of thousands of dollars per month, but it was closer to $100,000 a month. What they would get is average about $10,000 to $12,000 just from scams each day. But I've seen call centers which are upwards of 200 employees, and they can make more than $8 million a month. Now, I have encountered a victim in the UK who had already lost £100,000 to scammers. People write to me as well to say that they have lost a lot more than that again. And again, there's practically nothing I can do once the money has already been stolen. Seeking out victims, criminals absolutely use social media. I'm on a Facebook group where scammers sell people's personal data, and there's very little enforcement for that. They will also sell things like credit card numbers. Those are sold openly on Facebook. I get to hear a lot of the calls that scammers make, and I've heard everything from teenagers right through to people in their 90s falling for these. The types of scam, though, that I look at are more likely to affect older people. Fairmark Travels were a little bit different from the average scam call center that I look at because they pay a third party to put adverts onto websites. And the advert itself is called a malvert, a malicious advert. It goes full screen, has a bit of very loud audio saying your computer is a virus, but most importantly, it has a phone number on it. The one way to tell whether it's a scam is a phone number. If you see a phone number on your screen, 100% of the time that is going to be a scam. Your antivirus will not ask you to call a phone number. They wait for victims to come to them, then they would simply get the inbound calls. So that's how they seek out victims. The kind of victim they're after is somebody who's not computer literate. I have to lull them into a false sense of security. So I have to appear convincing. I can't be somebody who is very good with computers, type stuff in really quickly because they'll instantly get suspicious. So whenever I engage with scammers, I have a voice changer. I know in advance what my name, address, credit card, and everything else will be. I also have a fake bank page, which I will deliberately flash or show to a scammer to make it look as if I have loads of money. All I need is a little bit of knowledge about the system they use to make that phone call for me to hear other phone calls. I not only can hear the calls, I can see the phone numbers they are calling, and I can see a phone call has lasted more than, say, 5 minutes. It's very likely that that person is being scammed. And what I do is typically call the person when they've hung up and say, by the way, did you know that you were not speaking with your bank or you were not speaking with Amazon? And that is quite often a surprise to the people who've been on the phone for so long because they can be incredibly persuasive. They use terminology all the time. There's never a victim. There's always a customer. So you're a customer, of course, and that's the term I kind of hate because not one person that I encounter is a real customer in any shape or form. Yes, process, and whenever you go for an interview in a scam call center, you have to use the term an Amazon process or a banking process or a refund process, but that is just shorthand for the refund scam or the bank scam or whatever. Whenever they build a rapport with their victims, everyone will sound just like their grandmother or their grandfather because that way they sound more endearing. Obviously, when I can see one computer, just like the phone system, I can potentially also see the CCTV system that he used. A good example is Fairmart. I can see the guy actually run up his CCTV cameras, and he logged in with the username of admin and an 8-character password. It enabled me then to log in and just use the computer or the CCTV. The scam room itself actually had 4 cameras pointing all 4 directions, each corner of the room. It was difficult to know exactly who you're speaking to. Obviously, they give fake names, but knowing that they will want to connect to my computer, the very easy thing to do is to change my desktop background to a very garish color like purple or green or something. And then as the scammer connects to it, look on the CCTV and see who has got the green or purple screen. And then I can pinpoint and go, right, I'm speaking to that particular guy in the corner there. That's the one I'm going to focus on. So I'll be kind of picking up bits and pieces of files which may be on their computers, again, just to help identify who they are. Sometimes some of the computers have ID card information or spreadsheets with real names on it. So I'll be kind of looking for that. I know this is a little bit vague, but equally I don't want to let the scammers know exactly all of my tricks, but there are definitely techniques that I can use to figure out exactly what they're doing. I was in the fortunate position that not only could I see live CCTV, but they actually had recordings of historic events. And when I did rewind the footage, I could see them position certain cameras and actually turn them around. I was able to kind of roughly work out where things were, but I still couldn't figure it out. So I have a colleague who does something very similar to me. He's called Carl Rock, and he's in India. He has got a drone. And I asked him, would you be able to help me take photographs to kind of figure out where these scam offices are? He flew the drone over the top of the main building and then out to the back of the building as well. When it comes to reporting crime, it's actually very difficult in India. The best way to get any action on the ground from India is to go directly to the local police where that call center is nearest. It is not enough to say the people in that building are pretending to be a bank or Amazon. What I have to do is present a victim to the local police to say this person has had money stolen and it comes from that building. And here are the people involved. And that makes it very, very difficult. Obviously, I try to approach the police to say, this scam is operating on your doorstep, but quite often that's ignored. And it's kind of a tolerated scam. If you seem to be stealing money from rich Westerners, for an example, that may be less of a crime in those countries than maybe other types of crime. Now, in the case of Fairmart, I was working with a documentary team. The BBC were involved. The police became interested only because of that involvement. Then the police raided those buildings. So they arrested Amit Chowan. They dismissed the case because there wasn't enough evidence. I would love to see tougher laws when it comes to call centers. I think there should be laws to say, if you're running a call center, you have to give the person you're speaking the details of who you are, where you are, your real name and your real company name. It would be easier, I think, to prosecute some of the scam call centers, and maybe that's the way to reduce some of them at least. I actually ask scammers, why do you do this? The answers that I usually get, there will be people who say the only way that I can make money is through scamming. And undoubtedly that's the case. But everybody's different. There are not enough jobs for young people. And don't forget, these people in general, they speak English, so they're well educated. They come from the equivalent of middle class backgrounds. They have their education levels. I've seen the CVs sitting on some of the computers. They generally know what they're getting into. So if there was an opportunity to have another job, some will tell me that they will take those other jobs. And some of them do say, I have no choice. I'm only going to do this for a year or two. I personally think the primary reason is the reason why so many people are in it is greed. I have had scammers who've said, well, I do this as kind of revenge for colonial corruption. I do speak to some scammers who do have a conscience, and some of them have already reached out to me and exposed their own bosses in the whole thing. And that's admirable. India is more than likely where your robocall is going to come from, which is a really sad reflection on India, because India is a fantastic country. But it now means that people, when they hear an Indian accent on the phone, are just that more wary, and that is incredibly sad. Other than India, I have personally encountered ones in Ukraine and Tunisia. The Tunisian call center targeted French-speaking countries, including France. There's a few different ways that scammers will attempt to find victims, and I guess the primary one, someone pretending to be your bank or a large company like Amazon. Unfortunately, if you've got a landline, that is a typical thing you will hear every single day. And one of the biggest ones, for example, is a fake invoice. If you've started a conversation with a scammer, they want to get at your money. And they will target you in a few different ways. The first one is wanting access to your computer and therefore wanting access to your bank account. They will get you to make a transfer, or they'll blacken your screen and they'll make the transfer. The other one is they don't really need or want access to your computer, but they will try to convince you to go to your bank and move money by socially engineering you to send money or withdraw money, put it in a box, and people unbelievably still do this, and send it to another address. And the third one is they will persuade you to go out and buy a gift card, and there's different ways that they can do that, and read out the gift card number. And if you do that, that's equivalent to directly putting it into a scammer's account. And the most obvious way these days of getting money cleanly for scammers is to use cryptocurrency. There's other sorts of scams. You may have seen SMS messages saying there's a parcel being delivered, or a different sort of SMS message targeting someone in your family. Recently, I've come across a group who were operating out of London, and they were pretending to be the son or daughter of someone who had lost their phone. So they would send a message saying, "Hi mum, I've lost my phone. This is my new number. Can you contact me on this? I need to get some money quickly." It's not easy having multiple identities, and I have my own family life to deal with like everybody else. Doing this in the evening times did take up an awful lot of time, so I do work very odd hours, and I have to keep the same hours as scammers do. So, I'm on the night shift just with the scammers as well, so it can be difficult. I have worked in IT for quite a number of years, although these days I could maybe teach a course on it. I haven't got the formal qualifications. Because I have dug into scams more than the average person, I probably know scams better than most scammers. I'm still learning. I still want to understand better some of the systems that scammers use. They evolve, but I would like to think I evolve with them. I am working on projects that will help victims using AI before scammers start using AI against victims. So I have a YouTube page. The channel name is Jim Browning, which is dedicated to combating scammers.
My name is Nick Leeson. I'm a former derivatives trader. My reckless trading unfortunately resulted in the collapse of a 233-year-old merchant bank with losses of $1.2 billion. And this is how crime works. I had the biggest position. I needed the most money, the most margin. I was reporting the biggest profits. I was very much the ascending star within the organisation for a period of time, but then had a very spectacular fall from grace. I had the opportunity to move to Singapore in 1992. In Singapore, I ran the whole operation for Barings. It was very much a new business. Barings has a historic reputation amongst banking in the UK. It was 233 years old. It was one of the oldest merchant banks, if not the oldest. All of the transactions that Barings would have made during that period were with other financial institutions. So big fund managers, other banks. It wasn't a bank where you would have normal people having accounts, making investments. All your trades for the day, those have all got account numbers on them. The 5/8 account is the infamous account where I kept any losses. The reason behind the 5/8 account is 8 is a lucky number in Chinese folklore. If there were any errors, those errors would be captured in Singapore and then reported back to the UK. So the type of errors would be, you've got 2,000 people or 1,500 people in a trading pit. So it's very easy to think you've got one person's eye line, but you've actually got the person behind you, behind that person's eye line as well. So they might think you've traded with them. There might be price discrepancies. So all of those stuff has to be reconciled during the course of the day, and that's what would go into an error account. So that's where the 5/8 account was born. That was sent back to London, and after a period of time, London said they didn't want to see all of the detail, so it was kept in Singapore. So it's on one of those occasions, late at night, 4 o'clock in the morning, one of the girls who worked on the trading floor, you could see that she'd passed the trade incorrectly. The very next morning I go in to see Simon Jones, who was the head of the operations department in Singapore, sit down, tell him that we have an error, ask me to quantify it. I said about £10,000, that's where it was. And he asked me to refer it back to Andrew Bayliss, he was the head of the trading area, and would have understood it very, very quickly. So, it's 8 o'clock in the morning in Singapore, that's probably 2 o'clock in the morning UK time, so I'm not going to be able to get hold of Andrew Bayliss. So then I'm in this massive dilemma. Do I wait for the market, on the market open, do I cut that immediately, which is the way that you are supposed to follow through on this process, or do I take a chance and see if the market gets back to the level that the position is, and then I don't even have to tell Andrew Bayliss. And I've got 4 or 5 hours to run that position and see what happens. And unfortunately what I chose to do is the latter. Throughout the time that I worked at Barings, not at Morgan Stanley and definitely not at Coutts, but throughout the time I was at Barings, I would see people put trades into error accounts all of the time. So when it came to my turn to see if I wanted to put something in an error account and hold it for a period of time, it was far too easy because I'd seen so many people do it in the past and not be reprimanded, not get caught. And that's the first really bad mistake that I made in my business career. And it's, unfortunately over time, it just grew and grew and grew. To look at the 5/8 account chronologically, there's a year-end audit in September of 1992. The loss at that stage is up to $5 million. Deloitte's are coming in to do the audit. There is a $5 million discrepancy in the year-end accounts. Deloitte's put that down to a foreign exchange discrepancy, and somehow I managed to survive for a little bit longer. By May of 1993, the loss is $20 million. And then in May of 1993, we have the most perfect expiry in the options market. The options expire at the most perfect level. I make all of the 20 million back, and I have a £250,000 profit that I need to get rid of, which is a lot easier to do. I transfer it to somebody's trading book in Tokyo and genuinely go home that weekend thinking, that's great, I can start again now. I'm young throughout this process. I was 25 when I moved to Singapore. Not a great deal of management expertise. The people that worked for me were my friends. They were never admonished. They were never reprimanded. So on the Monday morning, when somebody makes a mistake again, it goes back in the 5/8 account. As difficult as the previous 7, 8, 9 months have been, I very stupidly put the trade back into the 5/8 account. One of the reasons is that I've corrected it once. I probably think I can do it again. And that's when it started to blow up. The markets are moving aggressively lower. I'm the wrong side of the market, so these positions are getting bigger. I'm doubling down. I think by the end of 1994, I probably had about $600 million from London, from the Treasury Department in London. So the loss has to be fairly close to that number. Everything's done with hand signals. It's very noisy, it's very boisterous. Before I arrived in Singapore, there was only one main product, which was the euro-dollar, which is also traded in Chicago. But Singapore was filling a gap, if you liked, between the US, Europe and the different time locations. So the Nikkei 225 had only really kicked off in the last year or so in Singapore. And so it meant that in Singapore you went from trading 2,000 contracts a day to trading 20,000 contracts. And that meant that the Singapore International, well, I think everybody wasn't ready for it. The rule of thumb is that it takes about 30 minutes to match a trade. You and I trade, we both put in a little trade ticket, a docket. One's a buy, one's a sell. You put those into the system on the trading floor, the CIMEX system, and you hopefully those trades match. So they need to match as to quantity and to price and month. And if it doesn't match, then you have to resolve that issue as quickly as possible. Because the settlement systems weren't able to deal with it on the floor at the time because of this massive influx of volume, it was taking 14, 15 hours to match the trade. So it was, and that means you've got exposure for that period of time, and you've got all of these tickets that are flying around, getting lost, and all sorts of stuff going on. So that was the backlog that was being created during that period. If you go back to Barings, back at the time of the collapse in 1995, we'd only just taken on an internal audit team, as ridiculous as that sounds. We had a risk manager, we had one risk manager. So if you go into Citibank or somewhere now, there would be 3,000, 5,000 people working in risk management. There would be a similar number working in compliance. But at Barings at the time, the risk manager, the compliance officer were the same person. So you would find people double jobbing. When I was trading and people that I knew would have been trading back in the 90s, we'd trade and then we'd tell people that it had been done, whereas now it's part of the process. Singapore is it's quite a controlled environment. The Porsches, the penthouses, the yachts wasn't the life that I was living. I have to be honest, I really didn't see that. It was much more family orientated. You'd go out as you would in any walk of life, and you'd enjoy yourself at the weekends. You'd go to concerts and the like. I think Singapore is a country that doesn't have a drug culture. The penalties are really severe, so you didn't encounter anything like that. And it has strict rules, about outraging female modesty and stuff like that. So there are things that you can get away with a little bit, but they're not the sensational stuff that you might see on Wolf of Wall Street or one of those type of movies. Singapore wasn't that country. When I moved to Singapore, I took a pay cut because it was the opportunity I wanted more than anything else. And so I think my salary probably was £50,000 at the time. That would have been in 1992. Obviously the salary has increased quite significantly over that period. But Barings were renowned for paying big bonuses. It was, I think my smallest bonus at Barings was a year's salary. And that would have been fairly standard. I think what bonuses do is they create a lot of short-termism. So people are trying to hit numbers so that their bonus gets paid, and you can see that definitely happens. If you look back at some of the reporting that I was doing during that period, people were focused obviously on the profit. I think as long as it reflected a profit, there wasn't enough investigation that went into it. The problem was that I was the outlier on pretty much every metric you can imagine. I had the biggest position, and all of that should have attracted more attention, but unfortunately it didn't, because the focus was on the money that was being made, and if you were reporting a profit, it tended not to be investigated that much. There were lots of people getting 7-figure bonuses in the senior management roles at that time, and some people getting even more than that. Barings was a charitable trust. Why was it a charitable trust? If you're a charitable trust, you can pay bigger bonuses than you can in a corporate entity at that particular time. You know, I know I get a lot of flack because it was a charitable trust and it did do a lot of good, but it was also a vehicle that enabled Barings to pay huge bonuses to their staff. I certainly didn't confide in anybody during that period, but there were a couple of other episodes in Singapore or in Asia at that time. There was a guy who worked for Barings in Hong Kong who was sacked for misrepresenting the profit on his trades. The problem for me was that every time I stepped over the mark, there was never any pushback. I was always pushing further and further. It was very Jekyll and Hyde during that time. I knew what the reality was in terms of the trades. As much as I didn't want to look at the trades and look at the statements and see the number in front of me, because it was, you know, it was a mix of frightening, embarrassing, and a number of other emotions as well. You couldn't distance yourself completely from it, so you knew roughly what it was. But then you had to go out onto the trading floor and appear confident and get involved, and still you're trying to manipulate the situation so that you can get the market to go back up. And you know, everybody thought that every time they traded with me they lost money, and they probably did, because I was manipulating the markets in both locations. But ultimately, as the market collapsed, I was the one that lost far more money than anybody else. So there is always that facade. You then go home, you've got a domestic situation where your wife thinks that everything's okay, she's got a great lifestyle, she's enjoying herself in Singapore, and you've got to maintain that as well. So you're balancing all of these, but it's all a tissue of lies. You know, underneath it all, you know, there's no stability. It has the potential to crash down at any particular point. The parallels that people draw with gambling, I think anybody who works in the investment or financial markets always shies away from the association, but there are parallels, right? The doubling down is one of those. Or the other parallel that you can draw is that a lot of people, when they're gambling, they start to chase their losses. And so there was a lot of chasing in this situation as well. And I'm sure if you speak to any bookmaker, they make most of their money from people that chase their losses. Barings was a very small bank, so a treasury department that would look after the funding and where capital was deployed. So I would send emails on a regular basis asking Treasury for more money. Treasury was in London, and they would send that money over, and there would be an intercompany balance between the two parts of the organisation. I knew that they were having difficulty getting the funding to me, that it was getting more and more difficult over this period. The capital base of the bank was only £250 million. Right, so it was a small bank, but yet they'd sent me £650 million. So they were borrowing the money. They were borrowing it from Barclays, they were borrowing it from Citibank, and they were feeding me in Singapore to continue going with the process. And then at the beginning of 1995, it became even more difficult for them. Barclays and Citibank refused to lend them any more money. Obviously, they'd bypassed some sort of credit limit. They went to the stock market and they issued a bond for £100 million that also found its way out to me in Singapore. So from a governance perspective and looking at things holistically, you know, they weren't testing or challenging what was going on at the time. You've got a small bank, so £250 million worth of capital. The legal limit you can lend to a subsidiary is 20% of the bank's capital. So that's 50 million. I'm 13 times in breach of that limit, you know, because I have £650 million with me in Singapore that are funding my illegal positions. And it's more than 2.5 times the capital base of the bank as well. So these are, you know, when you look back and you look at the sort of numbers, it's outlandish that it was allowed to get to that sort of level. You have to report this to the regulators. The regulator at the time was the Bank of England. So the Bank of England would get a report every single day that would detail how much money was being lent to Singapore. And they could see that they were exceeding the legal limit. But the Board of Banking Supervision, which met after the collapse of Barings, asked the Bank of England what they were doing, and the person who worked in that role, who was looking at the breaches, and this is actually in the report, it says that it was too far down in his in tray and he hadn't got around to it yet. So it's like when you look back at Barings, it's a systemic breakdown in the system that includes regulators, auditors, and so many different people who really weren't doing their jobs. Me very much included. My incompetence and negligence is very much at the forefront of everything that went on, and there's no excuse for that. But I accept full responsibility and accountability. But there were hundreds of people that should have been a bit more aware of what was going on. Obviously, it's a bit of a confidence trick in terms of if they would ask me questions, I'd be very confident about my responses, even if it was complete and utter rubbish. I'll give you an example, right? So we had a squawk box in Singapore where I would pass orders to Osaka, which is where the Nikkei 225 orders would be transacted in Japan. So one day I got a phone call from Andrew Bayliss, and he was concerned because my position limit was 250 lots of the Nikkei 225, and he could see trades that were massively in breach of that. So a trade for 5,000 contracts, a trade for 10,000 contracts, and many of those on the same day. So clearly in breach of the position that I was allowed to hold, and many times in breach. So I told Andrew that what he was actually seeing was that the settlement system was grouping together trades at the same price, which is complete and utter rubbish. You couldn't trade that sort of volume at that particular price. But if he'd really understood the business, he wouldn't have been asking me. He would have phoned Osaka and said, how did you receive the order? And that would have thrown everything out. Everything would have been exposed at that point, because the orders would have been buy 5,000 at the market, buy 10,000 at the market, and fairly rapid order as well. But because he didn't understand how the business fitted together, he didn't go that far. So there was a great deal of knowledge. There's a lot of people who went to really good schools, really good universities, but however much knowledge you have, if you don't understand the business, you can't challenge it. That allowed me to somehow wiggle through some of those controls. So you go from thinking I'm not going to get exposed this minute because they haven't done it yet. I've got a day, or I've got 2 days. And then you think in terms of weeks, and then you've got maybe, after a period of time, you think I've got a month to correct the situation. And still they're not asking the right questions. So you get a little bit more confident. The balance sheet, the financial accountant in Singapore would only pick it up on the last day of the month. So that's the only day that the 5/8 account had to be zero. So I'd sell a load of options, I'd receive the premium, that would take the account balance line down to zero. And as long as I was getting margin from London, I was able to continue this ad infinitum, or until the bank ran out of money, which unfortunately is the result in this case. So the pressure starts to build through 1994. There's lots of things that are happening on the success side of it. You're winning awards on the Singapore International Monetary Exchange for the highest customer volume. 90% of that is for my illegal 5/8 account. So, it's a success. It's something that's feted by everybody within the organisation. But again, the reality. This award is for your 5/8 account, for the illegal trading account. And again, how do people accept that we're doing this volume of trading, or they look at the bona fide level of trading that they're seeing reported and they're winning an award? It just doesn't correlate. But yet the management would come from London or Tokyo to help me receive those awards. There'd be a party. They hired out Grand Central Station, New York, to have a party after the conference. And the only person who didn't attend was me, because I was in the bar downstairs getting drunk. It was probably, that was probably above the limit of what I was able to continue balancing, juggling at that particular point. There was all of these people having a conference about the money that we were making in Singapore. At the beginning of 1995, Ron Baker is talking to me about what my bonus is going to be. Is £500,000 enough? And they're conversations you don't want to have, and that the pressure is starting to build. Can't bring myself to enunciate what's happened over this previous period and put my hand up and be honest about what's going on. I'm in Ireland at the end of 1994, and on the very last day of the month, one of the girls in the office, she phoned me up and she said, we haven't done anything with the 5/8 account. And so I said, just pass a one-sided journal entry, credit the account, just buying a bit more time. But I didn't expect to go back to Singapore, but I still can't put my hand up, you know, my wife, my family, and tell them what's going on. So I stepped foot on the plane back to Singapore. There's an earthquake in Kobe, the markets start to fall even quicker, which means that position is increasing more dynamically. And the loss is, you know, £650 million, so probably $840 million at that particular point. I've made this one-sided journal entry, so the balance sheet doesn't agree, so I've got to come up with an excuse, and that's what becomes known as the SLK receivable, where I'm trading an OTC option, which I have no authority to do. It's for 7 billion yen, so it's not a small OTC transaction, and then I have to manufacture an audit confirmation to prove that as well. An OTC transaction is an over-the-counter transaction, so it doesn't happen on the exchange floor. Deloitte's wanted an audit confirmation about the amount of money, which obviously I couldn't provide, but what they did do is they asked me to seek out the audit reconciliation, which isn't something that would happen these days. So I went home, or I may have done it from my desk in Singapore, but the audit confirmation needed a signature from somebody at Spear Leeds Kellogg's. I managed to get a signature from somewhere and really just pasted it onto the document where it was required. Went home to my apartment in Angula Park in Singapore and faxed it to the auditors. So when the auditors received it, on the top of the piece of paper it says, from Nick and Lisa. So you can see that it's not come from Spear Leeds Kellogg. There's only one inscription on the piece of paper, and it's from my house. And yet they still accepted that and didn't ask any more questions. So the lack of oversight throughout the whole story is quite astounding. You know, if you look at Auditing 101, that audit confirmation would break every rule in that. And I'm just trying to keep going through this process. On the 23rd of February 1995, somebody came to me with a reconciliation of the 5/8 account. Right? A reconciliation should be done every single day. At Morgan Stanley, I used to do the reconciliations myself. Nobody did those reconciliations for a 2.5, 3 year period. But in February, at the beginning of February 1995, London, obviously concerned about the amount of money that we had in Singapore, the lack of the amount of reporting that was coming back from my office in Singapore as well. They sent a settlements person, Tony Railton, out to Singapore to look at what we were doing. But still, it took him 20 days to do a reconciliation. And when he did that reconciliation, it's black and white, right? We only have two accounts, London and Tokyo. You add them together, you compare it to the Singapore International Monetary Exchange, and there's a huge discrepancy. And so when he confronts you with it in black and white, there's no excuse, there's no explanation, right? There's nothing that's going to wash at that particular point. So you make your excuses, you leave the office, and you go back to home, you pack a bag, and you get out of Singapore. And you're really not aware of quite how disastrous or calamitous the effect of your actions is going to be. I didn't know that I had twice or 2.5 times the capital base of the bank with me in Singapore, but you want to get out and then just see what happens and then work out what your next move is from there. So it's fight or flight. I never expected the bank to collapse. Yes, I knew there was going to be a considerable loss, but the bank had sent that money to me, so I thought, I didn't really think about it, but you would have expected that the loss was something that they were able to consume. So on the 23rd of February 1995, when I left Singapore, the plan was to go to Phuket and meet up with somebody who worked on the trading floor, just to try and work out how bad everything was. But all of the flights to Phuket had gone in the morning. So the only place we could get to that afternoon was a place called Kota Kinabalu, which is the Malayan side of Borneo. So that's where we flew to. We stayed in the Shangri-La, just trying to work out quite how bad the situation was. Went down into the local newsagent in the hotel we were staying in and picked up the Asian Wall Street Journal, and the headline is British Bank Collapses. So that kind of hits you full in the face and you realise quite how bad it is. You know, that's starting to build. Trying to pretend to be normal at the same time, which is difficult. Obviously, my wife is more aware of what's going on now than she was, but you still don't really want to talk about it too much. So do you go to Australia and New Zealand, or do you go right and try and get back to Europe? So after a day or so, we had to change hotel because the hotel that we were in was very touristy. Obviously, the story is everywhere on the TVs and in the newspapers, so you're a bit worried about being caught there. So we go into a more local hotel down in downtown, but we're trying to work out where we can get back to. And the only flight that's going out anytime soon leaves from Kota Kinabalu, goes to Brunei. Brunei, it goes to Thailand. From Thailand, it goes to Abu Dhabi. And then from Abu Dhabi, it goes to Frankfurt. No reason or rationale for flying to Frankfurt. It was the first European destination and obviously was closer to the UK. Didn't really expect to get through passport control in Malaysia. Expected to be stopped and detained there, but somehow we managed to get through passport control. We had to wait for 8 or 9 hours in Brunei, then sort of made our way to the boarding gate, and above the boarding gate there's a TV, and you know, this is the only story that's on repeat throughout the whole period. So you're trying to get on the flight without anybody recognising you, which we just about managed to do. You sit down and they're giving out newspapers as they used to do in the day, and your picture is on the front page of all of the newspapers. So you sat there as well, and you're trying to put blankets over your face and silly sort of stuff. And what was happening at the same time is the travel agent obviously had recognised me and had reported that she'd sold a ticket to us, and she'd reported that to somebody, and then eventually it got to Interpol. So now Interpol are looking for us. When I arrived in Frankfurt, however many hours it took to get there, the police came and arrested me off of the plane. To suggest that there was a massive sense of relief would just be a lie. You're just facing the next hurdle. Part of that was getting my wife sent back to the UK. The original charges said that we were travelling on false passports, which we weren't. The charge was removed for my wife at the time. You're being moved to a different prison in Höchst in Frankfurt. You know, you're kept on 24-hour lockdown for a week, which is tough. And you're going through that very emotional process of losing your freedom, and it's tough to deal with. It was a time of the Balkan states were all breaking down, so there was a lot of gun runners, there was a lot of people from Yugoslavia. So it was a dangerous place, and it's your first time in that sort of population, and you've got to traverse it and work your way through it. You're going through this constant turmoil about what your sentence is going to be. The speculation in the English media is that it could be up to 84 years. We speak to the Serious Fraud Office. We threatened to go to the European Court of Justice but they're all just delaying tactics until we're eventually willing and able to explore some sort of deal with the Singaporean authorities. And we're not negotiating with the Singaporeans. They arrive in Germany, they want to take me back immediately. They offer a maximum of 8 years in prison. Specimen charges, and there are certain other conditions. I have to pay a certain amount of money to the Singaporean police, I have to make a formal apology to the people of Singapore. Yeah, we agreed to the deal, which would be 5 years, 4 months in prison. And, Germany was tough, dangerous, but Singapore was tougher, probably less dangerous, but a much tougher regime. In Singapore, the prison was Tanah Merah, so it was maximum security. Everything is very regimental. It's modelled off of some sort of military regime. You have to squat down when you see an officer and say "Good morning, sir," and things like that. I'm sure you don't see them in too many English prisons, to be honest with you. But yeah, it's tough. Everybody's a triad gang member. I was the only exception. Other English inmates who might have had a drug offence or something, They had to choose sides in terms of who they wanted to support. And the boredom is unbelievable. You're locked up for 23 hours a day, so your daily regime would be somebody waking you at 6 o'clock in the morning, giving you your breakfast to the cell, so it would be 3 pieces of bread and a cup of tea or a cup of coffee. At lunchtime, you'd go out into the yard for an hour, so I used to run for the hour. Then you'd go back to the cell, do a little bit more exercise. Food would be delivered about 12. So it'd either be chicken, a fish, which was quite small and had lots of bones and the head on it still, so I wasn't too keen on that, or mutton, you know, some fairly old, pretty rank sort of lamb. And rice, which you're not used to eating 3 times a day, so you have to kind of get used to that. And then your dinner would arrive at about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And then lights out about 8 o'clock at night. And there's nothing in the cell. They're pristine white. You sleep on the floor. There's enough room for 3 of you. And there's a hole in one corner where you go to the toilet, and there's a small barrier that kind of dissects that a little bit. If there was one advantage of Singapore, because there is so much control over what goes on, it's fairly safe. You know, there is violence, and the violence is really quick, it's really brutal, but you can avoid it. When something does happen, and there would be gang clashes, so you'd get a gang clash every now and again, and there would be, you know, there would be weapons that would be used that they'd either brought back from workshops or they'd made themselves somehow from a toothbrush. The guards would come in, commando guards with full battle gear on, with big sticks, and they would start hitting people over the head unless you were on the floor holding your head in your hands. So it was brutally put down, but it maintained a degree of safety within the prison. So I never really had any issues. You know, I had one sort of disturbance with one of the main people in my wing on one occasion, but I used to kickbox when I was when I worked in the city. So, you know, I was able to sort of survive the 30 seconds or so that was required in that. You know, I used to get a lot of letters. So you would get the letters Monday to Friday, not the weekends. So on a Monday, you'd start, the thought process would be that you've got a 1 in 5 chance of getting a letter that day. And then if it doesn't arrive, you know, the next day it's 1 in 4, so it's an improvement. So as long as you can reframe the way that you're thinking about different things and break it down into smaller periods. So visits were few and far between, but you could look forward to those. So it was all about reframing how you think about things in order to survive. But yeah, it's tough. Whilst I was in prison in Singapore, they used to regularly change my cellmates because they didn't want them getting too friendly with me, maybe. So they would change my cellmates on a fairly regular basis. And on one time, I'd had a couple of Malay inmates that were getting on quite well. They were from different gangs, but they shared a religion, so they would pray and do that sort of stuff. And there was no reason to change them. But the guards turned up and they said, "Oh, we've got to." They bring you out of the cell, empty the cell completely. There's nothing in the cell anyway. It's not a great deal to empty. And they brought us all out, and then they said they were changing my cellmates. I said, it's ridiculous, right? So I said, look, I'm not going back in the cell then. And so they decided that for my disobedience that they'd send me to the punishment cells. So I stayed in the punishment cells for about 31 days. The door never opens. The daylight is blocked out. They turn the lights off during the day and they turn them on at night. So there's a bit of sensory deprivation. But your food is given through a cat flap in the door. So it's a lot tougher, and you know, there's nothing in the cell. So you literally can walk up and down, that's it. And you work out that if you walk up and down 750 or 755 times, that's an hour. And that's how you pass the time for 31 days. So I went back down to the general area, and then about an hour or so later, I was called for a visit, and it was the British vice consul who was there. So she said that, you know, I'd lost a bit of weight, didn't look particularly well, my eyes were bloodshot, obviously I'd been in the punishment cells, and, you know, starting to get a bit of pain in my stomach. So I went to see the doctor in the prison. He then took some blood tests. My red cell blood count was low, so he gave me some iron tablets, and that was it. So I'd go back and the iron tablets would arrive every day, you'd take those. The pain's not getting any better. They took me to a hospital close by. I was in A&E, and the doctor who came down found the lump straight away. So he said, I'm going to need to send you to the ward upstairs. The guards have got guns, there's big double doors, and you're chained to the bed. So it's a little bit over the top. One day when I was there, you know, they'd done a couple of investigations. By this stage, they decided that it's cancer. And they told my lawyer, and they found me curled around the bowl in the toilet bowl, just because the tumour had got so big that it pushed onto my lung and collapsed my lung, so that I was incapacitated in the toilet. So they took me down for an emergency operation. They removed the tumour that was 10 centimetres by 7 centimetres, and then you know, I had 38 staples in my stomach, and then after a couple of days, they took me back to the prison. And then they said that they wanted to give me chemotherapy inside the prison, but you know, I refused the chemotherapy on the basis that I wasn't going to let them leg cuff me to the bed, to which they were all aghast. They were showing me the rules and regulations that you have to go. But then eventually they made a decision that I could go and just be like a day patient, and go and get the chemo for 5 days, or 5 continuous days, and then it would be 3 weeks off. So I did that for 6 months. And then, you know, that would have been August of 1998, and then I was released in July of 1999. I wasn't released early or anything. Everybody gets a standard 1/3 remission, so I would have been released in accordance with those rules. After I fled Singapore on the 23rd of February, the sort of chronology from that sort of point would have been the 24th. Everybody would have been aware that the bank was insolvent, couldn't trade anymore, and they were running around trying to do their best to rescue it. That would have continued over the weekend, 25th and 26th of February, with the Bank of England. And on the Monday, which is the 27th of February, the bank was ultimately sold for £1 to ING. I think the Barings name is still out there in the US. I think it's the fund management side of it. Barings Asset Management was never taken over by ING, so Barings Asset Management has always been around since the collapse of the bank. They didn't offer me my job back. As to the question of whether no bank is too big to fail, I mean, it's a difficult one. I think banks are an important part of the infrastructure of many countries, and there probably are one or two that are too big to fail because they're involved in so many different transactions at so many levels. I mean, I think Lehman's is probably the obvious example. What ensued after the collapse of Lehman's was a global financial collapse because there was fear, there was panic, and Lehman's were involved in so many different transactions at different levels. With Barings, it was one country, it was all in Singapore, it was all in one product, which was the Nikkei 225. So it was easy to contain. And what you find now is that a lot of trading is done within the hedge fund industry. Yeah, nobody else went to prison. There were a few of the directors that were banned from holding other directorships for a period of time. You know, I'm often asked if I think that's just. Yeah, probably. You know, they didn't do anything criminal. Their only thing that they're guilty of is, you know, a fairly high level of stupidity to allow it to happen. You know, they've got to look at themselves in the mirror. I think that's the most damning thing that they have to do in relation to their involvement in the collapse of Barings. But you know, I'm front and centre. Fully responsible, totally accountable for everything that happened. So I was released from Singapore in 1999. I signed an injunction for £100 million whilst I was at Heathrow Airport from the liquidators, and then was spirited away in a car. And then slowly from there, you know, you kind of have to get back into life. And you know, being in prison for 4.5 years, you're not quite institutionalized, but you're you're not used to making decisions, on a very basic basis. I wasn't used to wearing shoes because, you walk around barefoot in Singapore for nearly 4 years whilst you're in prison. So it took some reacclimatization. Everybody was going to work on a Monday, and I was kind of left there feeling a bit empty. So it was important that I put some structure back in my life. So I did a psychology degree for 3 years in Middlesex, and then met somebody, remarried and moved to Ireland. In those first months and years, the liquidators were paying me a monthly stipend to continue to help them, but also that was based on me needing more medical advice as I was continuing my recovery from cancer. So, I used to say to the liquidators, if I go and get a job, what do you want? And they said, well, we want half of what you're earning. And that was, regardless of where the job was. I mean, I did TV interviews. There was one in Holland that went to the liquidators. Obviously, I'd serialised my return in the Daily Mail. That went to the liquidators. And then, given the opportunity to do some after-dinner speaking, I always used to be quite introvert, was a million miles away from being extrovert, so wasn't used to that sort of environment. But, I've been doing it for 26 years now, so I've got quite good at it. And I talk at keynote conferences as well and give addresses there talking about risk management, compliance and the importance of corporate governance. I do a bit of corporate intelligence work these days. That's kind of that. It's moved slightly to the side of that as well, that we look at some scams that people have got involved in where they've lost money, and we try to repatriate those funds. We have a number of cases with the financial ombudsman at the moment. I wrote the book Rogue Trader whilst I was in prison in Germany. I had nothing to do with the movie. So David Frost made the movie. He obviously recruited Ewan McGregor to take my role within the movie. The movie is taken from the book, so it's accurate. People driving around in Porsches in Singapore, it didn't happen. Me driving a beaten up old car going to the airport, it didn't happen. But that's the way movies get made, I suppose. So. I don't think any bank is really too much at risk from people going rogue these days. The controls are so much better. The quality of people in those roles is so much more superior than it ever has been. You've got, real-time data that is helping the situation as well. The problem is that you still have very niche areas that aren't getting the amount of surveillance and scrutiny that they should. So if you look at the more recent cases of financial scandal, there's one at Macquarie Bank, which was during the COVID period. Absolutely astonished that happened, but still, it didn't get to a bit more than 30 million, right? Still a big number, but there were a set of unique circumstances around COVID and working from home. You've got some family firms, Bill Huang, and the losses at Archegos Capital. Part of the family firms wasn't really an area that had ever been looked at. So it's been looked at, and the single stock exposure that he had was huge. Again, the lack of oversight and the lack of communication between the banks and sharing information, I think was quite shocking during that one. You've got FTX, which is in the crypto space, where they're trying to avoid all sorts of regulation. Very, systemic breakdown, kind of like Barings. The auditors weren't doing their job again. The regulators, if there was any during that period, weren't. And he was obviously going out and supporting political parties in the US and giving out lots of gifts during that sort of period as well. And everybody was believing the story, yet behind it was just a house of cards. I think it's very difficult to suggest or predict where the next big issue is going to come for the financial markets. There's a lot of spread betting and CFD firms that have been growing over the years. I don't think it's regulated as tough as maybe it should be. There's some unsavoury stuff that goes on in that area between different books that are traded. The banks have it right probably at the moment. You know, they've got the right number of people working in compliance, the right number of people working in risk management, and there's an awful lot of oversight and control of everything that goes on. I think the worry from a mainstream financial marketplace is possibly deregulation and what deregulation looks like. You know, it was a process. It was during a period of deregulation that, you know, I popped up to the forefront of everything that was going on. But you know, you would think that it's going to be better managed than it was in the past. But if the government are managing it, you know, maybe not. I think the industry over the last 20, 25 years or so, it's like an elastic band. The degree of regulation, the degree of control has just increased significantly. And that takes people away from the real challenges that they should be doing on a daily basis. I'm not convinced that AI is the answer to that. I think technology has a huge part to play in everything that goes on in the world of finance, but you know, delivering up more false positives is not going to be advantageous to the industry. I think it's already an issue where they're dealing, you know, a lot of people are dealing with those things. The controls need to be continually improved. I think crypto is an area that could be improved upon. I know they are resistant to regulation and to change, but I think there are so many episodes in the world of banking where there has been poor oversight, poor controls and scandal that I think they can learn. And I think therefore they should be more willing to learn. You know, one of the simplest pieces of advice I give to anybody in any situation, right? It doesn't matter whether it's finance, health, or anything else that's going on in your life. You know, I think communication is the most important thing you can do at any stage. So, you know, I always encourage, certainly my children, to ask for help and advice, right? It's the one thing I didn't do. And if I had, I would have been surrounded by people that would have helped me and pointed me in the right direction. Whereas I, at 25 years old, saw asking for help and advice as a sign of weakness. It was more the culture around 1990s banking. But if I'd seen it as a sign of trying to do things correctly, you know, things would have been very different. And, you know, I might still be working in a bank now. You know, the one thing that rings true for me loud and clear is that, you know, it's easy to get another job. It's not easy to get another reputation. So, you know, it's important that you always do the right thing.
Hi, I'm a producer on How Crime Works. If you like this video, please subscribe and comment below with more topics that you would like us to cover.